Have you ever wondered why you do something automatically? Why you reject a certain way? Why certain things trigger you? Why you can find yourself repeating a behavior and think, why do I keep doing this? I don't even know why I do it. Well, what if some of these patterns aren't simply who you are? What if they're things you learned? And what if you learned some of them so early in life that you don't even remember learning them? Let's talk about what I call subconscious programming. Now, I want to be very clear here about what I mean by that. I'm not saying your DNA was programmed. I'm talking about the learned patterns, the automatic behavior that developed through observation, repetition, practice, and reinforcement. Think about a little child. The child doesn't come into the world knowing how to tie their own shoes. Nobody hands them a pair of shoes and says, here's the information you need, memorize it. What they do is they watch, they try, and they get it wrong, and then they try again, and they practice. And somebody says, good job, so it's reinforcing that. And they do it again and again, until one day, they don't even have to think about it anymore. They're just tie their shoe. That's the learning that's becoming automatic. Think about the alphabet, A, B, C, D. At first, you have to consciously think about that as a child, but through repetition, practice, reinforcement, eventually you recite the entire alphabet without thinking about every single step. The same thing happens when we learn our address or our phone number, how to write our name, how to ride a bike, how to perform a skill. The brain learns through repetition, and here is where this becomes much deeper. Children don't only learn skills from repetition. They learn from watching the people that are rearing them, especially the ones that are responsible for them. They watch the adults, how they communicate. They watch how they handle anger. They watch the adults and how they respond to mistakes. They watch how adults express love. They watch how adults deal with conflict. They watch what happens when somebody says no, and they watch what happens when somebody cries. They even watch when they get rewarded or they get punished or they get ignored. And they learn not necessarily through those words, but through actions. And sometimes the most powerful lessons aren't spoken at all. They're demonstrated. They watch, they copy, they practice, repeat, and reinforce, and then it becomes automatic. That's what I mean when I use the word subconscious programming. The child isn't sitting there saying, I'm going to create a belief system today. They're developing a pattern through their experiences, both internal and external, in their environment. And the first 7 years of life are especially essential and important period of development because the brain is rapidly developing and learning from that environment. Now, I don't want you to misunderstand me. I'm not saying that everything you learn before age 7 is permanently locked within you. And I'm certainly not saying that by age 7 in some magical cutoff date where the brain stops learning. That isn't it at all. The brain continues to change throughout our lives. And that's where this conversation is going to get really powerful, because what's learned can be brought into awareness, and what becomes conscious can be examined. You begin asking, is this really who I am, or is this something I learned? Maybe I learned that you always have to be strong. Maybe I learned that asking for help means that I'm weak. Maybe I learned that my needs don't come first, they come last. Maybe I learned that making a mistake means that I'm not good enough. You get the point. Maybe you do all those things and you shut down when conflict begins. Maybe you learn to keep everybody happy so that you can feel safe, and maybe you carried the patterns for decades. But because you consciously choose to, but because it's primarily familiar and it became automatic to you, it became normal to you. And here's the part I want you to hear. Familiar doesn't necessarily mean true, and automatic doesn't necessarily mean permanent. This is where neuroplasticity comes into the conversation. Your brain has the capacity to learn, and learning doesn't stop because you became an adult. You can become aware of an old response or pattern or belief. You can pause and you can choose a different response, practice that response, repeat it, and reinforce it. And over time, you're giving your brain new information and new experiences to learn from. You're not reaching into your brain and literally deleting a file called childhood. You're developing new patterns and strengthening those new patterns. And that's what I mean when I talk about rewiring and refiring. And later, when we talk about epigenetics, we're going to take this conversation one step even further, because epigenetics doesn't mean that your thoughts magically rewrite your DNA. Your DNA sequence isn't being rewritten because you changed your mind. Epigenetics is about mechanisms that influence how genes are regulated or expressed without changing the underlying DNA sequence. That's a different conversation, but it's an important part for you to understand something profound. Our biology is responsive to our environmental, internal, external, and our experiences in our world. So let's begin all of this together, right? So you were born with a developing mind. You entered an environment. You watched, you experienced, you copied, you practiced, you repeated, and you reinforced, right? And some of those patterns became automatic. And then you grew up, and some of those automatic patterns followed you. But now you can see them. And once you can see them, you can begin to question them, right? Once you question them, you can begin to choose differently. And when you repeatedly practice something different, you give your brain the opportunity to learn something different. So maybe the question isn't, what's wrong with me? Maybe the question is, what did I learn? And then an even more powerful question is, what am I ready to learn now? Because you are not limited to the patterns or beliefs you learned as a child. You are a living organism, changing human being, and the story doesn't end when the programming began. The story continues when you become conscious of it, and that's where the rewriting begins. So we'll jump into epigenetics after this video. Please subscribe, like, comment, and let's get a conversation going, shall we?